For the past year, we here at the Park Avenue Armory have been following in the footsteps of the 107th Infantry as it's their centennial of their deployment and their fighting in France and in Belgium. Using social media, we've been doing a virtual exhibition of images from our archives here of the men going through training in South Carolina, embarking on the ships, getting to France. And a couple of months ago, a group of us went to Belgium and France and literally walked the fields of World War I and lay wreaths to commemorate their service. And it was very moving, and we had families of members of the 7th Regiment, of the 107th at that time, with us. We actually continued to have events here. We had a big event for Veterans Day with the veterans of the 7th Regiment here. And just a week ago, we had the descendants of the men who were awarded the Medal of Honor in this regiment here for a big ceremony, as well as the descendants of Sergeant Alvin York. And we celebrated with songs of World War I, and it was a really wonderful way to culminate this year of following them. But here we are on the other side of the armistice, and we're reflecting on the experience of these men when they're coming back and to a changed America. And certainly Prohibition is one of those big changes. The suffrage and the vote for women coming in the next year. America's changing at that time, and so certainly these men coming back from Europe had to change with it. Our guest speaker tonight is Michael Lerner. He's the principal of Bard High School Early College and has taught at Barnard College, NYU, New School University, and the University of Minnesota. He's the author of Dry Manhattan, Prohibition in New York City, and served as a consultant on the Ken Burns and Lynn Novick documentary Prohibition. He holds a PhD in history from New York University and a BA in history from Columbia University. Please welcome Michael Lerner.
Well, first, thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight. I know it's a dreadful night. I'm looking at this slide, we vote dry. I think the context has changed a little bit. I'm just going to get my timer going here because I want to make sure we keep things on schedule tonight. And I also just want to say before I begin that it is such a treat to be in this room. I've been at the Armory many times for many events, and I've always marveled at this room in particular and never really thought I'd have the opportunity to be speaking in here. And I'm just thrilled to be here. So thank you for having me. Thank you for coming out tonight. And as Kirsten said, yes, I'm the principal at Bard High School Early College, which is a partnership between Bard College and the New York City Department of Education. I'm a historian, and most of my work has focused on Prohibition and the history of Prohibition in New York City. My book, which came out a couple of years ago, is called Dry Manhattan, and it is meant to give readers a sense of what the Prohibition experience was like in New York City, how it was implemented, which is not very effectively at all, how New Yorkers resisted it, which they did enthusiastically, and the role that New Yorkers played in repeal. In fact, I'll build on what Kirsten said earlier. If the members of the 107th came back to New York expecting a dry city, that is not what they found, but we'll talk a little bit more later about what they did find. And tonight, my hope is to bring together these two topics, World War I and Prohibition. And Prohibition seems to have captured the American imagination for a very long time. It's still a very popular motif. Movies, I mean, I happened to be in a bar around Halloween, and in walked 20 people dressed up as flappers from the period. I was like, what is this all about? Remember, it's Halloween. People dress up like the 1920s for Halloween. And so Americans are really accustomed to sort of the storybook version of Prohibition, and they seem to get a lot of entertainment out of it. And I was delighted to hear about all that's been going on here at the Armory in terms of commemorating the end of World War I, because Americans, I think, are not very in tune with the history of World War I. I've been watching, over the past couple of years, I've been teaching a course on World War I. I'm in the third iteration of that course, and I've really been immersed in reading World War I history and teaching World War I for the last couple of years, ever since the centennial of the beginning of the war. And it has amazed me how little this seems to resonate in the American public. Until Veterans Day weekend this past week, there was almost nothing in the press about the impending centennial of the armistice. Even the president, I mean, do I dare go there? The president didn't bother to make it to the memorial in France because of the rain. So again, kudos to all of you for coming out in the rain to hear a talk on this. But there's so much there for Americans to think about, and it's really been a pleasure working through this topic with young people and realizing with them how much there is in the history of World War I to understand about this country. And so again, my goal tonight is to bring these two together. And for Prohibition, I tend to, everyone likes the flapper motifs and the speakeasies and all that. I tend to focus a little bit on the darker side because I think Prohibition does have a dark side to it. And I think one way to look at it is to think of it as the first modern culture war in the United States. That Prohibition was not just about alcohol. It was about immigration. It was about race. It was about religion. It was about ethnicity. And it was driven not by the fear of alcohol abuse alone, but really by the anxiety that America was losing its way, that it was turning into a different country, mostly because of the kinds of people who lived in places like New York City. That immigration was changing the nature of the country, and that Prohibition was in some ways a way to steer America to some better version of itself, and that whole project went very wrong along the way. So again, I'm bringing these two topics together tonight, and well, let's just take note of World War I to start, especially since the centennial of the armistice is upon us. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that World War I changed everything. I mean, pretty much anything momentous or important about the 20th century, I think you can trace back in some way to World War I. If you look at just what happened in Europe, the end of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the end of the Ottoman Empire, the end of the German monarchy, it sparked the Russian Revolution, and everything that flowed from that, we can trace back to the war. It set the stage for everything we see in the Middle East today. It put the U.S. on the world stage as a superpower, as an international power for the first time, and it drove the United States' vision of foreign policy for a century, really up until now. And this is really, I think, the period where we're seeing a break from that for the first time. If you look at the effects on New York, and again, I think we lose track of these as we go about our daily business, but if you imagine being in New York during the period of the war and think of the construction of the Brooklyn Army Terminal, which was directly related to the war, the expansion of the Brooklyn Navy Yard. It had been there previously, but it had to expand considerably. And you go through and you see these massive buildings, and they're all built in 1917, 1918. The United States went through a tremendous effort to get ready for the war very quickly, and a lot of that was happening in New York. The troops that moved through New York on their way to Europe, and then even in the city, that there was sabotage in New York, which is a part of the history we don't see. There was opposition to the war in New York. There was a very strong public debate over the nature of the war and whether the United States should be involved in it. And now today there are memorials all around us, which I think we have they've become invisible. We don't see them. And it doesn't feel like part of the life of New York City, but if you were here and alive in the period of 1914 to 1918, the war was very much a part of everyday life in New York. And if you were alive at that same period in New York, the debate over Prohibition was very much a part of your everyday life. So here's where the two come together. One of the questions I get asked most frequently about Prohibition is how it was passed. People just seem baffled, mystified how something like this could come about, because it seems like such an impossibly bad idea. And I always try to remind people that if you look at Prohibition in the context to larger phenomenon, it makes more sense. It makes a lot more sense. It's still a horrible idea. Putting a complete ban on alcohol in the Constitution is an unrealistic, extreme, and impractical idea, but if you look at it in the context of the times, I think you can see a little bit about how this came to be. The first is to put this in the context of the progressive movement. And the progressive movement, just to remind everyone, is a very broad-based movement that is, vibrant in American political life from the 1880s through to World War I, and pushes through a whole host of social, political, and legal reforms. And you might even, I would certainly consider World War I part of the progressive movement. It's often referred to as the Progressives' War. It's a movement that dared quite admirably to take on all of the problems that people could see in a growing industrial society. And it was a movement that gave us things like labor laws and minimum wages, safer housing codes and zoning, the Pure Food and Drug Act, women's suffrage comes out of the progressive movement. It is an attempt to root out corruption in government. It is aimed at breaking up the monopolies that were coming to dominate the American economy. It institutes our first environmental protections, and it brings us prohibition. So prohibition is really part of this movement. And if you're a progressive living in this period, there are a few ideas that are really going to resonate with you about prohibition. The first is that alcohol abuse was a real, genuine problem, especially in American cities and especially among the working class. So if you were concerned about the problems of the inner city, it's not a big leap to say that prohibition was an idea that you would be interested in. Progressives believed that the urban saloon was it might go too far to say the root of all evil, but certainly a corrupting force in cities, both socially and politically, and it needed to be cleaned up, if not eliminated outright. And it's always worth reminding people that the leading prohibition group in the United States was not the Women's Christian Temperance Union, but the Anti-Saloon League. So this idea of the saloon being the problem. And that thirdly, that the alcohol problem could be traced to two mammoth industries that wielded a great deal of political power, the brewing industry and the distilling industry. These were monopolies. They were wealthy industries. They were very influential. And to a progressive, they made as much of a target as the meatpacking companies or the oil refineries or the big banks. It was a sense that these are companies that are not good for the American public. They need to be regulated. They need to be dealt with. And so if you're a progressive living in this time period, all of this makes sense to you. And not every progressive supported prohibition, but there were plenty who did. And it's not out of line with the rest of the progressive ideals. And riding on the progressive influence, the prohibition movement makes a lot of headway in the years leading up to World War I. So by the time we get to 1910, about half of the United States is living under some form of prohibition at the local level. 12 states have gone completely dry at this point, and it's in 1914 where you see the first real effort to devise a constitutional amendment to ban alcohol at the national level. Now, keep in mind that all of these efforts are run in different communities and by different people with different interests and priorities, and there's a great deal of variety in what it meant to be dry. So, if this election poster here, vote dry, well, voting dry could mean something different in different places. It might mean doing away with the saloon, but there'd still be the sale of alcohol. It might mean a completely dry county. It might mean that liquor was banned, but beer was not. So there's a lot of inconsistency and a lot of flexibility in this, but the prevailing idea at the time is that county by county, state by state, city by city, the country is moving towards a drier future. And the final barrier is places like New York City and Chicago and New Orleans and Washington, D.C., that the big city is going to be the sort of the last holdout. And how do you make those places go dry? It's not going to be easy, and a constitutional amendment may be the only way to do that. Now, it's also worth noting that these reforms were having an effect. And in the years leading up to World War I, liquor consumption in the United States was actually decreasing. So this movement, like many progressive impulses or reforms, was actually effective. So hard liquor consumption is going down. Beer consumption is increasing, but that's not a horrible thing in terms of the overall view of alcohol abuse. That basically the stuff that concerned the dries the most, the consumption was decreasing. And there's a sense that, okay, there's something to this. We're moving in the right direction. So I would say Prohibition is the most extreme or most ambitious example of an attempt at a progressive reform, but it does make a little more sense, I think, when you think of it in the context of the progressive movement. So now we turn to World War I and how these two things come together. And this is not a question of whether or not Prohibition would have passed if not for World War I. There's really no point in arguing that. What I think is more important to understand is the way in which World War I changed the nature of the Prohibition movement. Because up until World War I, again, this is moving as a progressive reform at the local level, it's advancing along, and then when the United States enters the war, the total nature of the dialogue, the total nature of the debate changes. And I'm going to move to the next slide here. You find some very strange artifacts when you're researching Prohibition. It made sense in the context of war, that any nation would want to rethink the role of alcohol in society. And so what you see when World War I breaks out is that Russia imposes prohibition in 1914, just as it's mobilizing for the war, that Britain and France are both instituting stricter laws on opening hours for bars and cafes. It's hard to imagine France getting rid of wine altogether. They do not do that, but they're going to restrict it. Sweden and Norway restrict alcohol sales. Finland enacts total prohibition when it gains independence from Russia at the end of World War I. So there's a real sense that this makes sense. In a wartime climate, this makes sense. And so the dry movement latches onto this, and looking back at this 100 years later, it's almost amusing, but the dry movement basically said, hey, if this works for the Tsar, then it should work for us as well. And I just love the example of, like, look what the Tsar has accomplished in Russia by imposing prohibition. Look at the money that's saved. Look at the, what it does for the country. A practical lesson for America from the Tsar. Are we so far behind Russia? So this is the dries starting to link prohibition to the war effort. Now, in New York City, people thought this was impossible. When people talked about prohibition coming to New York, it was laughable. There was no way in the world New York would ever sign off on prohibition. But you start to get the propaganda, and this is not from New York in particular, but this is the mood that once the United States enters the war, we need to be able to get our priorities straight, and it's a choice between booze or the war effort. And the dry movement very successfully starts to cast this as in a sense, as a national security argument. That if the United States is going to be an effective force in this war, then it has to do away with the alcohol problem, and we have to rethink what we're doing. So just to give a New York example, once the war began, the mayor of New York at the time, John Purroy Mitchell, imposed a 1 a.m. closing time for the city's cafes, saloons, and cabarets, winning praise from the New York Times for doing so, and it noted, 1 o'clock in the morning is a late enough bedtime for a people who are awaiting the summons to war. Okay, so there's a sense if we're going to sacrifice, everyone's going to sacrifice. Let's see, I have another slide here. I'm going to come back to that one. The sacrifice. Food supplies were of great concern, I think less so in the United States and more so in Europe. I mean, Europe was devastated, and the United States was providing a great deal of relief. So the dry argument is that we cannot waste wheat on alcohol, on beer and whiskey, when we need to provide relief to Europe. And so there is a very coordinated effort, both within the dry movement and by the United States government, to promote the saving of wheat and resources to fuel the war effort. And so you have the Lever Act passed, which forbids the use of any grain for distilling. And you have limitations on the alcohol content of beer. So beer is reduced to 2.75% alcohol. And all of this, again, is the argument that we can't afford to waste grain on the production of alcohol while there's a war going on. It reminds me a little bit of the victory garden logic in World War II, where the argument is made everyone has to grow these gardens and everyone has to recycle cans, and in the end, really none of that was doing anything for the war effort, but it was a form of public sacrifice that boosted morale. You don't see the argument that, okay, we'll stop drinking whiskey, but wine's okay because no one's going to send grapes to Europe. We can still use grapes. We can still drink cider. It was, let's do away with alcohol altogether. That's what we need as a country for the war effort. And so you get the arguments like this. There's also the argument that you need to do this for the soldiers, both not just in support of them that you're sacrificing symbolically for them, but they need to be kept away from alcohol. And the Navy in particular, I mean, if you want to bring back the phrase like a drunken sailor, there's a real concern that alcohol is a risk to men in uniform, and so it became illegal to sell liquor around military bases, and it became illegal to sell liquor to any soldier in uniform. And in the Navy in particular, all alcohol use was prohibited. The tradition up to that point had been that officers could drink, but the enlisted sailors could not drink. And the Secretary of the Navy, Josephus Daniels, who was a very adamant dry himself, did away with the rule and imposed a complete ban on alcohol within the Navy, so that neither officers nor sailors could drink. And the term cup of joe for coffee actually comes from Joe is Josephus Daniels. So that's sort of the way, it tells you a little bit about how the sailors looked at that. But again, there's a sense that we need to wage an effective war. Drink hinders. I mean, the sign, the poster says it all. Now, I mentioned the darker side to this. The dry movement certainly succeeds in promoting the national security argument, the sacrifice argument. They also silence the opposition by taking a very anti-German streak as this plays out. So anything German became suspect in the United States. German newspapers were shut down, German schools closed, German associations closed, and the brewing industry, which was dominated by Germans, was vilified in particular, especially by the Anti-Saloon League. They had one of their lines from one of their pamphlets: everything in this country that is pro-German is anti-American. Everything that is pro-German must go. And so they didn't pull their punches on this. They were quite serious about this. In New York, the German hospital and dispensary changed its name to the Lenox Hill Hospital, so we'll make that a local connection. The Germania Life Insurance Company became the Guardian Life Insurance Company. The Metropolitan Opera refused to perform German operas. German language newspapers in the city declined. German churches stopped conducting their services in German. And again, it's just anything German is considered suspect. Now, Germans had been, understandably, some of the most vocal opponents of Prohibition, especially within the brewing industry, but just within German communities in general. And suddenly, it's very dangerous for them to speak out. They've been effectively silenced by these anti-German campaigns, and the language gets quite hostile. We have German enemies across the water. This was in a politician in Milwaukee. We have German enemies in this country too. And the worst of all German enemies, the most treacherous, the most menacing, are Pabst, Schlitz, and Miller. So really, playing up that the German breweries. Now, the German brewing industry didn't play its hand very well in all of this. They were caught in a very embarrassing scandal as the war was unfolding, where they had been receiving money from the German government. And so the United States Brewers Association and the German-American Alliance were both investigated by Congress. The German-American Alliance charter was revoked. But it really was not to the extreme degree that the Dries painted it out. I mean, they just kept going on and on. German brewers in this country have rendered thousands of men inefficient and are thus crippling the Republic in its war on Prussian militarism. The un-American, pro-German, crime-producing, food-wasting, youth-corrupting, home-wrecking, treasonable liquor traffic is the enemy. So. Again, they were, the point of this is fairly obvious, that if you were German, you were silenced. And I don't think it's any mistake that the final push for prohibition succeeds when this movement is silenced. The German-American Alliance, for instance, had 2.5 million members who understandably would have been against. I mean, some of them even offered, like, we can give up liquor, but beer, please, let's keep beer. But there was no room for that discussion in the context of wartime. So if you spoke out against prohibition, you were basically branded a traitor. And this became a very us versus them kind of argument. And so what all of this means is that prohibition now has this clear path. The amendment, which was first proposed in 1913, does not pass in 1913. It's proposed again in 1915, and it fails again in 1915. But in 1917, once the war has begun, and once this campaign, and linking it to national security is out there, then the amendment is ratified and sent to the states, and it will be passed in less than a year and a half. And ratified, interestingly, in January of 1919, 2 months after the war is over. We'll come back to that. So the Dries pushed and used the war and basically got what they want, and the ratification of the amendment takes place in 1919. So let's take stock of where we are. It's 1919 now, which by the terms of the amendment meant that prohibition would go into effect 1 year later, so in January of 1920. The Dry movement has made the case that the war provides justification for prohibition, and now the war is over, and it's not clear what the United States has just agreed to prohibit. And that's another big part of the problem. So let me move to this. Okay, going through the New York Times and the digital archives, I just loved this headline. So this is from when the treaty is signed in June 28th, peace signed, ends the Great War, Germans depart still protesting, prohibition until the troops disband. So this became the logic, that even though the war is over, demobilization has not been completed. So the treaty is signed on June 28th, and on June 30th, wartime prohibition goes into effect. And again, I love that. 2 days after the war is over, wartime prohibition goes into effect. This left President Wilson in something of a bind, and he, I think, understandably was far more focused on the treaty and the international politics, and he basically deferred to the Attorney General of the United States at the time, A. Mitchell Palmer. Wilson was not a Dry. He was not fond of prohibition. He thought it was unrealistic. But the Attorney General was all for it, and the Attorney General was the one who made the decision that wartime prohibition would remain in effect until demobilization was complete. And there's a 6-month lag here. So if you can make it until January, then the amendment will kick in. So this is sort of, what it really does, and I don't think people really have a sense of this, that wartime prohibition brings prohibition to the United States 6 months early. So just, I do like people to imagine what it would be like to be in New York in the summer of 1919, and the war is over, and the troops, 300,000 troops, come back to New York that June alone. Europe is in chaos. There is labor unrest all over the United States. The Red Scare is underway. There are race riots throughout the country. The global flu pandemic is picking up, and by the time the winter arrives, 150,000 people in New York will have been, caught the flu. 20,000 of them will die. And wartime prohibition goes into effect. And it just, to make sense of all of this, this is actually a picture of that last night, June 30th, 1919, the night before prohibition goes into effect, wartime prohibition goes into effect. And I look at this picture and I mean, I'll ask you to ask yourselves, do these look like people who are ready to give up drinking for the rest of their lives? I don't get that feeling whatsoever. I mean, what the newspapers described it as was New Year's Eve in June. And that, I think this is important because it highlights what the sense was in the city and in many American cities about where this was all going. And, you had liquor stores having fire sales, essentially. Buy as much as you possibly can, because Prohibition did not prohibit possessing liquor, only the sale of liquor. Places like this, the Saloon, I don't know where exactly this is, but it is in New York City. They're going to stay open until someone tells them to shut down, and when they do tell them to shut down, they kind of reopen in other guises. New York was not really, New York was on the fence about this. There were people who said, let's give this a chance, and there were other people who said, no way, this is never going to work, especially since we don't know what this means. The terms of the law, the enforcement law, had not been spelled out. So, we go into the Prohibition era. And I think the next interesting thing I'd want to highlight is here we see I think it says it all, the soldiers returning. And, so for a reform that was made into reality partially on the argument that we need to do this for the soldiers don't seem to be so into it. And so they are coming back, and veterans ended up being some of the most vocal opponents of Prohibition. And here was a letter to the New York Sun, actually. I volunteered my services as a soldier for Uncle Sam to help make the world safe for democracy. Am I to sit idly by and permit freedom to be denied me? Another group opposed noted that they had been entrusted to stop the German army, but they were not trusted to hold a glass of wine. And so there's a sense that this doesn't make sense to them. And this is sort of Prohibition was not passed democratically. It never had majority support. And the people, if it was passed in part in support of these soldiers, they're coming back and saying, this is not what we want. And they weren't sure if anyone cared. Now, this gets even more pronounced once the Volstead Act is passed, and that is the Enforcement Act. And what that does is it finally spells out the terms of what Prohibition was going to mean. And people were unsure that was Prohibition going to keep beer legal, was it going to keep wine legal? And what happened was the Dries managed to get the strictest possible interpretation passed, which was that anything over 0.5% alcohol was considered intoxicating and therefore illegal in terms of you could not manufacture it, transport it, or sell it. And again, possession was not mentioned. Wilson vetoed this. He thought this was completely unrealistic, but his veto was overridden in one day. And so that set the enforcement tone for what was going on here. So what we get is a very strict interpretation of Prohibition. We have a situation where the logic of doing this for the war no longer holds any water. You have the veterans coming back and saying, we're not for this. And interesting, there's a character that I write about in my book a lot. His name is William Anderson. And he's not someone who's received any historical attention, but he was the leading voice of Prohibition in New York City. He was sent to New York to make New York go dry, and he was determined to do it. He did get New York miraculously to ratify the Prohibition Amendment, much to everyone's shock. But when he heard in 1920 that these veterans groups were opposing Prohibition, this was his comment. Everybody honors the men who served in France, but that service to the nation does not warrant them in now turning against the welfare of the country which they once fought to defend. On the contrary, they are held to a higher degree of patriotism and devotion to the public welfare, and the public expects that the great service which they have rendered shall have permanently enriched their characters, So in other words, they should know better, and he wasn't going to listen to them. And so basically what you see is a dry movement that digs in. And once 1920 rolls around and the full effect of the Volstead Act comes in, you see a transformation of prohibition from a national security argument, a progressive reform, into a social control. And this is where it gets ugly. So prohibition is on the books. All of the arguments that this will be impossible to enforce, well, the logic was, let's just make this as harsh as we possibly can and people will get in line. So the initial enforcement statutes levied fines of up to $10,000 and 5 years in jail for violations of the Prohibition Act. This is the first time in the history of the United States that a constitutional amendment has been used to curtail rights rather than protect them. And now we're sort of in this stalemate. New York did not stay dry for one day. And the first arrests actually happen on the very first night of wartime prohibition. They never stop. And what you start to see is widespread disobedience to the law, which takes on different shapes and different forms in different communities. The term scofflaw comes out of prohibition. It was a newspaper contest for someone to come up with a term to describe a prohibition violator. So scofflaw was the award-winning entry. But people came to see very quickly that prohibition, it was enforced, but enforced very unevenly and very unfairly. And it depended largely on your class. And so if you were a wealthy New Yorker, you could go to your private club. The Yale Club was notorious for this and was raided a couple of times. But you could hold private stashes of liquor and consume them as long as you wanted to, as long as nothing was sold. And so, you know, that whole notion of stockpiling. If you went to a nightclub, you know, the right people could be paid to look the other way. And what you had was a situation where waiters would be the ones selling the liquor, and the owners could say, I don't know anything about it, I have nothing to do with it. So if there was a raid or an arrest, it's the waiters who are taking the fall. You do see the saloon sort of disappears and turns into something different, and sometimes it's very conspicuous and sometimes it's very out in the open. But it just, you know, New York State had 200 prohibition agents assigned to it. Now think of the Canadian border, think of the Long Island coastline, and think of all of New York City and the 200 men, many veterans included in this bunch, who are asked to enforce this, and it's a joke. Now it still means you're going to see lots of arrests. In the first year alone, 16,000 prohibition cases enter the New York City court system. 60 new court cases are coming in every day. They soon develop a several-year-long backlog, of course, as judges are furious. They feel like their hands are tied, they're embarrassed. The plea bargain becomes the mainstay of criminal justice, where they would have what they called bargain days in the courts, and the judges would walk in and say, anyone who pleads guilty leaves today with a fine. If you go to trial, we're going to throw the book at you. And so you had this kind of churning of people in and out. And this went on for years. I mean, prohibition lasts 13 years. And this goes on, and it sort of becomes this hypocritical status quo. And people can see, they start to see very quickly the degenerative effects of this. The chief magistrate for the city warned that new immigrants were going to lose all respect for American law because they could see that it was applied unevenly and it didn't make any sense. Corruption became a bigger problem. If the Dries were concerned about the corrupting influence of the saloon, and I found cases of this in my research of, you know, police officers or prohibition agents being offered $20,000 cash on the spot to just turn around and walk out of a warehouse full of liquor. Agents who go into roadhouses and pass the hat and say, put enough money in there and no one gets arrested. There's all sorts of cases like this. It cripples the police department. Hospitals, it becomes a bigger public health problem. Alcoholism wards in New York City fill to the brink. That is not a sign of a city that has given up drinking. And as we all know, the organized crime history that comes from this. But I focus less on organized crime and more sort of on the everyday bootlegger. Most bootleggers in New York City were run-of-the-mill working-class people looking to make an extra dollar. They were grocers, tailors, florists, cab drivers, you name it, who knew that there was a market, knew you could make a quick buck, and didn't think anything was wrong with doing it. And so this becomes sort of again, the status quo. What we're left with is disillusionment. And again, I'll bring it back to the war here. I mean, what World War I left in its wake was a disillusioned generation. A group that saw that the war, which was promoted around these lofty ideals, that it was going to be the war that made the world safe for democracy, that it was the League of Nations was going to resolve international disputes in the future, that the United States would take on this role in the world of being sort of the champion of democracy and of self-determination, that did not come to play out in the 1920s, and people began to question what the war had been for. It seemed to many it had been for nothing. And at the same time, you see prohibition as the law of the land embedded in the Constitution, and to most New Yorkers, at least, it appeared to be a joke. But what can you do about it? It's in the Constitution. And there was a famous senator from Texas who said that, I'm paraphrasing here, but there was a better chance of a hummingbird to fly to the moon with the Washington Monument tied to its tail than for prohibition to ever be repealed. No constitutional amendment had ever been repealed, so why should anyone think that this one would be? And for the next decade, this plays out, and there was a sort of an acceptance that the problems, prohibition is not working, and that the problems that it's producing of corruption, of undermining law and order, of promoting more alcohol abuse, are just going to be things that we have to accept and live with. And it's only with the arrival of the Depression that you see a successful movement take shape to repeal prohibition. I'm not going to go into all of that, but the parallel here is interesting that the 1920s becomes this period of acceptance of everything that's wrong, and the 1930s, finally there's a sense that enough is enough, and between the Depression and the sense that something must be done about it, and the sense that prohibition has run its course and has to be done away with, those two come together in the New Deal. And I think it's no coincidence that among Franklin Roosevelt's first 3 acts of legislation, one is repeal, that he legalizes beer by executive order, basically, while waiting for the Prohibition Repeal Amendment to pass. So I'm going to stop there, because I think that should give you, my hope is that gives you a little bit more of the relationship between prohibition and the war, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Okay. Yeah, sure. So the question is, what's the relationship between immigrant groups and prohibition? I want to be careful not to characterize all immigrants as drinkers or as dry or as wets. But generally, the immigrant groups were groups that were coming to the United States with a strong drinking culture. And that varied from culture to culture. So some groups had wine, some groups had beer, some groups had whiskey. Scandinavians actually had a very strong dry movement. So there were actually like immigrant dry groups in New York City. So I don't want to paint them all as being one and the same, but most immigrants who found life in New York hard really valued holding on to some element of ethnic drinking culture as part of what made life bearable as poor immigrants in the city. So but they did not have the political clout to really do much, especially when the saloon is being attacked, because the saloon for them, or whatever ethnic variant of the saloon they had, was a big part of their community. So they certainly saw this in many ways as targeting them. They were not happy about it, but they didn't feel like they had a great deal of political power to do anything about it. And again, once the war, no immigrant wants to be caught in a position of being portrayed as treasonous. And so that silenced not just Germans, but I think many immigrant communities in general. The Irish also were in a particular bind. Supporting the war as an Irish New Yorker meant fighting as an ally to Great Britain, and many Irish were not inclined to do that for obvious reasons. So they also were in a bind. Yes. The amendment process was the same. So basically the repeal amendment repeals the Prohibition amendment. But yeah, it has to go through the states and be ratified. And the repeal amendment was ratified faster than the Prohibition amendment. And I think at that point the Prohibition amendment may have been the fastest ratified. I can't remember exactly, but contrary to the expectations, it was ratified quickly, and there was consensus in the United States at that point that Prohibition was done for. They were backing away. I mean, for the place. So Russia gave up in 1925. With some of the same realizations. This is not going to work. It's not working, and the costs are greater than the benefits. And so the cost of bootleg poison. I mean, I didn't even get into all the poisonous alcohol that you see in the United States. And if it was a wartime necessity, those countries basically said, okay, we don't need this anymore. So there is. I do think it's interesting and important to look at this as an international movement. So it's not this peculiarly American thing. It was, an international thing. But they did sort of back away from it before the United States did. Absolutely, and I think it's important. So I'll clarify one thing that I also think is important. There's the difference between temperance and prohibition. So the temperance movement had existed since the early 1800s. And was very much geared at domestic violence and the abuse and all of the problems that we associate with alcohol. The difference is that temperance is basically when I say, I'm going to stop drinking. And prohibition is when I say, you're going to stop drinking. And that's an important shift. And the idea of encouraging people voluntarily to give up alcohol and recognizing the abuse or the problems was a different impulse. And so the women's temperance movement was very much about, let's convince people of this as opposed to let's impose this upon people. So the Anti-Saloon League was not a temperance organization. And I mean, they were lobbyists. They were lobbyists and lawyers and very good. And I think it's one of the, the unfortunate characters of Prohibition that Prohibition is blamed on women and men get the credit for repeal, when it's actually the reverse, that men should get the blame for Prohibition, and women actually get the credit for repeal, because it was women, especially Republican New Yorkers, who took a stand and said, if we are for public health, for law, for social order, for true, they called it true temperance, then you have to be opposed to Prohibition, because Prohibition is promoting intemperance. And it was the ability of women to come out and say this that allowed a lot of other Americans to say, okay, it's okay for me to be against it as well. Okay. Yes?
What year was the amendment repealed?
1933.
1933?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So it's a 13-year experiment.
So the states all reacted differently, though, because in Virginia, you could not have a drink in public until probably 1955.
Right.
You could buy liquor in a state store, but they shut down every bar, every restaurant, everything. Only a private club could serve liquor.
Yeah. What repeal does is it gives it back to the states, and it says if your state wants to be dry, you can be dry. If your state wants to have state-owned liquor. I mean, New York had a whole slew of very bizarre laws. You could not consume drinks standing after repeal. So I don't know what difference that makes. It hits you the same way, but the idea that they didn't want to return to the old-fashioned saloon. So you do see this evolution of laws. I mean, and some of them are still things that we deal with. I mean, if you remember that until several years ago, liquor stores were closed in New York on Sunday. Supermarkets still cannot sell liquor. Liquor stores must have a separate entrance to the street, and you may not own more than one liquor store in New York State. So there are all sorts of bizarre post-prohibition quirks, but it did basically relegate it back to the states.
Do we know anything about how much consumption was dropped by Prohibition? And as far as bootleg liquor goes, in New York, did most of it come in, or was it made here?
Great question. So in terms of consumption, I mean, this has been something historians argue about. You know, my personal take is there are no reliable numbers. You know, people who are breaking the law don't keep the best records that they're doing that. And so there are no reliable statistics on consumption. The general argument is that consumption decreased slightly, or it decreased somewhat initially and then rose back up. It's actually the alcoholism and cirrhosis statistics that tend to be the most helpful in sort of gauging where things were going, and also the crime statistics, which all indicate that consumption, you know, went up. I mean, I would say, you know, Prohibition wasn't meant to reduce consumption; it was meant to eliminate it. So, now, in the second part of your question, in terms of New York, it would. I mean, this is kind of a morbid comparison, but if you compare it to, say, the heroin trade, you know, it comes in different forms from different places at different times with varying degrees of potency and purity. And so you would have home distilled liquor that would kill people, and you might find a story where 20 people die in a weekend from poisoned liquor. You did have medicinal whiskey, which if you wanted to get safe, reliable whiskey, you got a doctor's prescription, and the number of pharmacies, I mean, this says a lot, the number of pharmacies in New York City tripled during Prohibition because, you know, medicinal whiskey was allowed to be made. So it was coming from all over. I couldn't, again, it's very hard to have reliable statistics on how much one source versus the other. It was coming in from all different places, and more liquor than beer, because beer is very hard to transport, very bulky, so you saw a shift back towards liquor. Which again, I think was not what the Prohibitionists had intended. So yeah, the question was about the Anti-Saloon League and the word saloon, and I think the New York Times had something about this the other day, which I didn't realize, that the word saloon, you cannot have a drinking establishment called a saloon in New York State, apparently. I was not aware of that. So, you know, the old-fashioned saloon really disappeared as sort of the men's working class living room, and it was replaced with, you know, the speakeasy. We think of speakeasies as being these very glamorous places. A speakeasy could be someone's apartment with a coat of paint and, you know, a couple bottles of booze. They were often, you know, they were hidden all over the place. But I think we have, you know, the bar as sort of the updated version of the saloon, but obviously with some of the working class, male-oriented elements toned down.
Do you have any tales about the effect of Prohibition on the 7th Regiment Armory?
I was looking, and I was trying to find something, and I couldn't. And the only thing I found, because I have a hard time. I mean, I was waiting in the other room over here where there's a bar and all sorts of nice closets, and I'm thinking, boy, you could probably stash a lot of booze in here. I don't know, but the one thing I did find was that Jacob Rupert, who was one of New York's premier brewers and owner of the New York Yankees, was a member of the 7th Regiment. And so if he were here, I can't think he'd be arguing for Prohibition. So I don't know. Maybe Kirsten,
that they decreased the drinking so much in this building.
Okay.
They did treat it as a club, so that is the Field and Staff Officers Club.
Okay.
And those lockers have lockers inside them with smaller lockers with keys.
Yeah.
And so it's the only room that has lockers inside lockers, which all are locked.
I think just put one and one together, and
Yeah.
I think that, yeah. And this was very common. I mean, most of New York's elite clubs did. It was, you know, it wasn't a secret. It was legal. There was nothing, as long as no money was changing hands, it was legal. There were clubs that were busted because a waiter or a member of the staff would be selling whiskey. And now I'm blanking on his name. He was the manager of the New York Giants. I think John McGrath, is that correct? Was arrested in a brawl in one of New York's elite clubs. And part of the whole controversy was that he said that he had bought 3 bottles of liquor from a member of the staff that evening and then proceeded to consume them all before getting into the fight that got him arrested. So, you know, it was commonly understood that in New York's clubs there was lots of liquor being consumed. Great question. I had a slide, but I took it out. Most breweries, and that's how I got into this topic. I was actually curious as to what came of American breweries during Prohibition. Many of them survived by making non-alcoholic malt beverages with weird names. Bevo was the one that Budweiser was famous for, but if you go through the newspapers, you see ads for these non-alcoholic malt drinks. They made ice cream, they made ice, they made soft drinks because they had the refrigeration equipment and they had the trucks, and so many of them survived doing one thing or another, and they were very grateful when it was all over and went right back to brewing beer. So many of the bigger breweries did survive Prohibition, including, I believe, Rupert survived. Rupert and Schaefer were the two big. I mean, Anheuser-Busch became a much bigger national presence after Prohibition. And in fact, Al Smith, who was the governor of New York, who was a major force in the repeal movement, there's a great picture of him at his office in the Empire State Building receiving a truckload, a wagon load of beer borne by Clydesdales from Anheuser-Busch, as sort of thanking him for his dedication to the cause. So, yes. Oh, okay. Yep.
This might be a little offbeat, but wasn't there a smallpox epidemic at the turn of the century that had catastrophic human fatalities around the early 20s in 1915? Did that have any bearing whatsoever on the Prohibition?
I'm wondering if you're thinking of the flu epidemic, which was basically an unintended consequence of the war. So yes, hundreds of thousands of Americans died in the flu epidemic of 1919 when the flu came back from Europe. And interestingly, the idea of medicinal whiskey, and that was one thing that people claimed, oh, you've got the flu, well, I've got just the thing for you. So the need for medicinal whiskey was actually something people thought about very seriously. So yeah, there was certainly an element of that 1919 climate. In terms of the states, I mean, they did tend to be southern and midwestern states that were dry. They were the most sympathetic to the movement. The taxation question is fascinating, actually, because I didn't get into this, but the federal income tax, most American federal government revenue came from liquor taxes. And there is a very strong argument to be made that not that the income tax was a conspiracy by the prohibitionists, but they certainly knew that you couldn't do away with 60% of the American government's revenue without having something to replace it. So the confluence of the income tax, federal income tax, and the doing away with the federal liquor tax, there's something there to this. So the argument about taxation and jobs, I mean, a big argument for repeal was that we needed the jobs in the Depression, and we needed the tax revenue. And neither one really panned out the way it was promised, but it certainly was part of the logic that the tax, that we need the tax revenue and we need the jobs, and it's another reason to get rid of Prohibition. Okay, thank you.